And I assume nobody is from a background in anthropology. Is there any student who has had or who has done graduation with anthropology as a discipline? Hai koi? So it's a rare species, the people who have done their graduation in the anthropology. Agree? So in order to study anthropology for UPSC, we need to first talk about the approach to study the subject. That's the first and the foremost thing that is required for the examination. Once your approach is clear, what exactly are we dealing with here? Then only we'll be in a position to understand the requirement of the examination first. Plus, majority of the approach that we have learned till now, or you have learned till now, will be from the toppers' talks. Of course, they are an invaluable resource where they talk about the pros and cons of the disciplines. We've heard it from so many toppers. Like this year, there were so many toppers. One of them is 4th rank, Siddharth Ramkumar. He had 326 marks, which is an amazing score in anthropology, which helps you get into the list also finally, right? Then there is Benjo P. Jose, who secured 303 marks. There is another student, Ayush Srivastav, who has secured 327 rank. Right? All have scored beautifully well in the anthropology, despite not having a background in the discipline. So anybody who is starting anthropology should come up with an open mind, with a aspect that I'm here for learning, plus using this learning to write very good answers in the examination, because without very good answers, you'll never be able to score good marks in the examination. ये एक बहुत बड़ा approach है. Now, what are the resources that one should refer to? अगर मैं पूछूं कि resources, पहले अपन housekeeping issues देख लेते हैं कि क्या-क्या पढ़ना है, कैसे पढ़ना है. Then we'll start something. What are the resources that one needs to refer to? Tamil Nadu, Kerala. Tamil Nadu publish करता है. Kerala, I think Kerala State Board publishes the SCRT books. Okay, what else? Amber and Amber. Then Sapiens, for the sake of curiosity, for the sake of understanding the nature of the discipline anthropology. Any else? Any other resource that you have heard about till now? कि यहाँ से पढ़ना है. Because most of us are clueless when we start anthropology. Only things we know about anthropology is what we have seen on the YouTube lectures or on the YouTube videos, or some of the things that we have seen through the syllabus, or maybe some basic book. That's it. Okay? So all of our ideas are very crude in nature, related to the resources that needs to be referred to. Of course, I'm here to teach all of them. I'll make sure that all of these are complete. Whatever is required for the examination is complete. But in general, we also need to know the resources, because the approach here will be, I'll be taking the lectures here, no doubt. I'll be dictating notes to you, majority of them. I'll be giving handouts to you. But without studying books, you cannot expect to understand or have a broad, holistic understanding of this discipline that is anthropology. Agree? Yes, no? Without going through these basic books, you will never develop a grasp or command over these disciplines. Because the UPSC exam is, the nature of the exam is pretty different. It is different from the university exams that we have appeared till now. Okay? Plus the GS is very different from the optional subjects. If you look at general studies, you need to have, the name itself is general studies. So the whole point is you need to have an overall understanding of the issue that is going on. But which is not an academic to the extent of the discipline that you study in the optional subjects. It is not that academic in nature. It does not have a background that you need to study, that how the concept has evolved. Whatever concept you study in the general studies, you need not learn about the evolution of those concepts or who were the original thinkers in those concepts. When you write answers in the examination, you never quote those thinkers in the examination in general studies in general, because not everybody has a background in those subjects. For example, if somebody is from anthropology, might have a tendency to use some of the anthropologists in the, let's say, paper 1 society section. Can happen. Then a person from political science background might have a tendency to use certain thinkers in, let's say, paper of polity. Might also use some of them in, let's say, ethics. But there is zero possibility that you will be knowing all of the concepts along with the thinkers who have actually talked about these ideas. There's a difficulty in that. So general studies is more general in nature. It is not that specific in nature. But here the optional subject deals with a very different phenomena, where you need to focus upon the issues the topics that are included in the syllabus from a traditional perspective, from a thinking that is known as anthropological thinking. Or if you are studying sociology, from a thinking that is called as sociological thinking. For example, in sociology, if somebody has gone through the syllabus, might know that sociology, one of the topics is sociological thinking. One of the topics in sociology is sociological thinking. Because what happens is, the phenomena that you see around you in the society that are happening around you, majority of these phenomena that you see around yourself, what you find is that these phenomena, anybody is able to understand them. There's not much difficulty in them. And you can come up with your own set of understanding and explanation of that phenomena. Let's say if we see, why is there so much traffic problem in, let's say, Old Rajendra Nagar? Okay? Or why is unemployment high in the society? You might come up with your own understanding and explanation. If I ask you about the issue of caste, let's say, you will come up with your own understanding and explanation. That caste system, because what you will be writing about it, it will be from your own experiences. Right? That is called as the commonsensical way of understanding things. Right? You would, whatever explanation that you would provide, you will say that it is a common sense to understand this phenomena. It is not very difficult to understand this phenomena. But once you start thinking in sociological terms, there are different streams, there are different schools of thoughts that have developed over a period of time in that discipline, which needs to be invoked while explaining a particular phenomena. Taking the example of caste again. To explain the caste system, because caste is a common topic in both sociology and anthropology in the paper too. So if you look at the caste system, to be able to explain the caste system properly, one needs to understand how the caste has been studied till now. All of us have some idea about the caste system. ऐसा तो कोई होगा नहीं इंडियन सोसाइटी में जो कास्ट के बारे में नहीं जानता होगा. Majority of our surnames are caste names only. Agree? We marry with people belonging to our caste. That is a general norm that is there in the society. Some people, of course, go for intercaste marriages, but the prominent norm in the society is to marry within the caste. If you ask your parents कि किससे शादी करनी है, the first answer would be what? क्या होगा पहला जवाब? कि कास्ट में शादी करनी? Yes or no? That is the first reaction. थोड़ा बोलो. Yes बोलने के लिए सिर्फ हिलाना नहीं है, symbolic नहीं. सिर्फ गर्दन ऐसे ऐसे करके थोड़ा बोलना पड़ेगा. ठीक है? People online, you should also participate. So you see, what happens is, to be able to explain the idea of the caste, let's say as a phenomena, you'll first have to know how the caste has been studied till now in the past. Right? How has the caste been studied till now? Anybody has any idea? Okay, historical perspective. Book view versus field view. Text references. So what happened is, whenever a regime is governing a country, they're always interested in understanding the society first. Without understanding the society, they will never be able to form policies for that country. Let's say the Mughals were ruling India. They also had some conception about the caste in India. When they came to India, they did not know about the Indian society, of course, when they were coming from the Central Asia. So when they came to India and they started ruling India, the first thing that they needed to do was what? The first thing that they needed to do is to explain, to understand what this society looks like. Right? So they tried to understand the society. The same problem was faced by the Britishers. When the Britishers colonized India, they wanted to understand what? How the Indian society looks like. What is the nature of the Indian society? That was the first thing that they wanted to do. Even before the Britishers came, who came to India were the Portuguese. Even before Britishers, we had what? The Portuguese coming to India. Portuguese came to India. They observed the Indian society. And what they observed is, some of the features that they saw in the society were like, people were marrying within only particular groups. People were marrying within only particular groups. This phenomena they called as the endogamy. It is a common term that is used for that. Right? That is, marrying within a particular group is endogamy. Marrying outside that group is called as exogamy. Simple. Right? So they observed that this society follows a type of marriage, or rather the rule for marrying in the society is endogamy. If you look at their food practices, these people generally avoid taking food from the members belonging to the other group. One group will dine with members of only that community. They will not eat food along with the members of the other community. Another feature they observed. Right? Further, they observed that there are certain groups which are considered to be high in the society. Their prestige is high in the society, while there are other groups whose prestige is low in the society. Their prestige is high in the society, while the other groups that are there, their prestige is low in the society. By looking at this phenomena, they looked back into their society and they found that we also have a similar kind of system back in Portugal. Because what was happening back then in Portugal was the Christians in the Portugal were trying to convert the Jews into Christianity at that point of time. They were trying to convert what? Jews into the Christianity at that point of time. अभी लिखना नहीं है. People online, writing will start slowly. पहले समझो कि subject है क्या. First we understand that, only then there is any point of writing any notes. Problem क्या है कि आजकल tendency सीधा notes उठाऊं, 5 point याद करके और बस चला जाऊं. एग्जाम में इतने ज्यादा पॉइंट हो जाएंगे, कम से कम 5 लाख पॉइंट हो जाएंगे कि याद ही नहीं रह पाएगा कुछ भी एग्जाम में. होता है ऐसा कि नहीं होता है? अपने कॉलेज के एग्जाम में तो क्या एक किताब रटनी है या आधे रजिस्टर को याद करना है. यहाँ पे ऐसे 1000 रजिस्टर हो जाएंगे अगर करने लगोगे तो. होता है ना? मेजॉरिटी ऑफ द लोगों ने रात को पढ़ के एग्जाम दिए होंगे सारे कॉलेज में. कौन समझदार लोग थे जो पहले से पढ़ रहे थे? सबने एक रात पहले ही पढ़ाई की होगी. मेजॉरिटी ऑफ अस हैव स्टडीड इन दिस मैनर. But here that is not possible. क्यों? Because the nature of the exam is such. जनरल स्टडीज के 4 पेपर 2 दिन के अंदर, 9 से 12. तो जब तक 4th पेपर लिखते हैं एथिक्स, तब तक सारे अंदर के अनएथिकल बातें बाहर आ जाती हैं. होता है ना? क्योंकि 4 पेपर है. 4th पेपर तक तो इतना पेशेंस लूज हो जाता है कि आपको लगता है मैंने पढ़ा क्या था इस सब्जेक्ट के अंदर. ओनली योर मसल मेमोरी हेल्प्स यू राइट. हाथ लिखता है, फिर दिमाग नहीं लिखता है. उसको सब याद होना चाहिए. इस चीज को आपको याद होना चाहिए क्या लिखना है. Brain does not help you in writing in the 4th paper. Same goes with optional subject. 5 दिन तक रिवाइज कर रहे हैं और 5 दिन तो you are lucky that you are getting 5 days before the mains examination, before the optional subject. In our times, there was no time that was given. So initially, when we chose 2 options back in 2012. So the way in which exam was conducted was first day, essay. Second day, English Hindi. Third day, GS1, GS2. 4th day, POBAD 1 and 2. 5th day, Geography 1 and 2. हो गया खत्म. तो ज्योग्राफी पेपर 2 तक तो आते आते कहानी क्या ही रही होगी, आप लोग जान ही सकते हैं. होता है ना? So here now the things have changed although, but still the reality remains the same. Only somebody who has internalized everything will be able to write it in the examination. Coming back to our discussion on the caste. Portuguese, when they looked at their society, they found that there is a phenomena that is similar in nature that they are observing in the Indian society. And this phenomena that they found in their society was basically the segregation of certain groups. For the Christians who were converting the Jews into Christianity at that point of time, the Christians who were converting the Jews into the Christianity, even after these Jews converting to Christianity, the old Christians wanted to keep a segregation from the new Christians. They wanted to do what? They wanted to keep a segregation. They did not want the individuals from these new Christians to merge, to marry with the old Christians. One of the ways to keep them segregated was to not allow them to marry. One of the ways to do this segregation was what? That we should not allow them to marry in the first place. If you stop them from marrying, the differences will be there. Agree? And they came up with a concept called as the purity of blood. They came up with a concept which is called as what? The purity of the blood. On this notion, they started talking and understanding that in our society, what we have observed in the past, the concept of purity of blood called as limpeza de sangre. It's a Portuguese term. And the term that they used for such a phenomena was casta. This was then extrapolated to the Indian society and the Indian social system that they understood, the features that they observed, and they started using the term caste, which was used later by the Britishers in the Indian society also. So Britishers started using this term caste for the first time to explain this idea of caste that is going on in the society, right? But even with this, they could not explain it, what exactly is happening. They thought that to understand this society properly, we need to go back into the original texts of the society, maybe the ancient texts of the society. The texts that are religious in nature, we need to learn them. Most of them went to the Rig Vedas. Most of them studied Mahabharata. They employed scholars to understand these textbooks, to be able to explain the Indian society and the nature of the Indian society. They studied Dharma Shastras, they studied Manusmriti. On the basis of all these books, they came up with certain features of the caste system. And the model that came out of this understanding was called as the Varna model. Because what they observed in this caste system is that there are 4 Varnas in the society. There are 4 Varnas in the society. What are these 4 Varnas? Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. Right? And there is one Varna that is outside the 4-fold Varna system. That is Avarna. These were generally referred to as the untouchables or the outcasts. Right? They came up with these 4 Varnas: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. Right? Then in this, they observed that all these Varnas, then they came up with the explanation that what is the origin of this Varna system. Let's say if the Varna system is established now, through the text, if you look at the Rig Veda, it talks about Varna. If you look at Gita, if you look at Mahabharata, they talk about Varna. Right? So what is the underlying idea behind these Varnas? They wanted to understand that. First, they associated these Varnas with occupations. The different Varnas were doing different occupations, were involved in different occupations. Different Varnas were involved in different occupations. And these occupations then started to be considered, these occupations then became hereditary in nature. They became hereditary in nature. And then what happened? Certain works were associated with high prestige in the society, while the others were considered low in the society. And that led to the hierarchical nature of the Varna system. This was an explanation. ऐसे कई सारे explanation आए. Some said that it was based on the guna theory. That your guna, your quality is going to define to which Varna do you belong. Some said that it is because of the Aryan invasion in India. That Aryans, who were basically people who migrated to India from the Central Asian region, when they came to India, there were Aryans. It is a theory. They said that the Aryans who came to India right at the end of the Indus Valley civilization that was there in the India. So it started to debate that the Indus Valley civilization inhabitants were the original inhabitants of India. And the Aryans were the ones who came from outside India. So they said that when the Aryans came from outside to the India, they reserved for themselves the upper castes, the higher Varnas, while the native Indians were then subjugated into either Shudras or into the Avarnas, that is outside the Varnas. Right? This kind of an approach of understanding the Indian society was termed as what? The book view of the society. Now, if you compare and contrast this with what you know about the caste, will it not look different? The explanation that you're going to go about writing about the caste. In general, if somebody is writing an answer in the general studies, will only come up with the idea that the person might know 5 to 6 characteristics of the caste at the best. But because it is an academic discipline, because it is an optional subject, we cannot just go on writing the simple characteristics. Even if we are writing the characteristics, we need to use the names of certain thinkers. For example, the 6 characteristics of the caste system that have been given, they were given by G.S. Ghurye. G.S. Ghurye, who is one of the earlier Indologists. Indologists are the ones who tried to study the Indian society through the ancient texts. Right? So you'll have to quote them in the examination. You'll have to understand the nature of these phenomena through these understanding. This was first initial understanding, which was known as the book view, which was deployed by the British administrators and the scholars to understand the nature of the Indian society. Right? Then what happened is, once this happened, the anthropologists, they started to go and understand the caste system in reality, that how it actually functions in the reality. They came up with a very different understanding of the society. What they found is, if you go in on the ground level and try to observe the caste system, they deployed different methods to understand the caste system. If you go and observe, you will not find the 4 Varnas existing in reality. Hai ki nahi? Whenever you talk to each other in reality, what happens is, if you, let's say, discuss your castes, will there any time be a mention of the Varna? Mostly people talk about their specific caste groups, which are sometimes also called as subcastes. Which are also called as what? Subcastes. So what was found in reality on the ground when it was observed by the anthropologists, They termed this new understanding of the caste on the basis of their field understanding. This view was called as the field view. And the model that emerged out of this understanding was called as the Jati model. With what was it called? It was called as the Jati model. So what came out from the book view was the Varna model. What came out from the field view was the Jati model. And then Jati model, various anthropologists, sociologists, because in India's case, the difference between the sociologist and anthropologist is not much. So they came out with understanding of the Jati model. And there are so many thinkers, M.N. Srinivas, S.C. Dubé, Harold Gold, William Weiser. They have tried to understand the Indian caste system through this Jati model, through their understanding of the caste system, how it functions in the reality. Right? Going back to the Varna system, initially in the Varna system, what do we say? In the Varna system, we say that these were castes which were functioning on what? Occupational basis. These groups were occupational groups. Brahmins were supposed to do the priestly activities. They were the keepers of the texts. Kshatriyas were supposed to be the warriors. Vaishyas were supposed to be the traders. While the Shudras were supposed to be the agricultural laborers. And all the menial jobs like manual scavenging, cleaning was done by the Avarnas or the untouchables, who are outside the fourfold system, right? According to this original model, that is what was found. But on the ground, if you go in the reality, do you still find the castes working in any kind of interdependency? क्या आज भी ऐसी इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटीज हो रही कहीं पे जो कि इस वजह से रिलेटेड हो? Do we find such a phenomena happening here? People online? ठीक है. और अभी भी करते हैं, right? Anybody online? Where do you find such occupational correlationship between the caste?
SCT में जो manuals के आदमी होते हैं उनको untouchable की class है.
Mainly उन्हीं caste से recruit करते हैं. Okay. The untouchables in the MCD, they are recruited from the lower castes in general, right? But what happened is another school of thought where they try to understand the Indian village and its characteristics, when they try to understand the social system of the Indian villages. When they went there, they found that the social system in India, in the villages, was a coherent system that was functioning. In which all of the castes were interdependent on each other. There was a system that had been created. They went and observed this phenomenon, and they found that at the rural level, if you go to the villages of India, you'll find that these subcastes or the jatis that you find, because the occupational relationship between the varna and the occupation is also difficult to establish. The only thing that you can establish in the field level is what? Is that one subcaste or the jati is involved in a particular occupation. For example, barber, nai, is a caste name. It is also a job. Khati, carpenter. It's a caste name. It's a job also. It's a economic activity also. है कि नहीं? लोहार caste भी है, तो लोहार एक economic activity भी है. So reality, what you find is it is not the varna that is doing the occupation. It is the jati that is doing the occupation. Right? And these jatis work in a very integrated manner. And the manifestation of this integrated manner can be found in the Indian villages. Where the traditional setup of the Indian villages is what? It is feudal in nature. Traditional setup of the Indian villages, feudal in nature, where there is one particular family belonging to a particular caste who is the owner of the lands in that villages. Majority of the land is with them only. In many of the villages, if you go, koi gaon se hoga to they will appreciate it better, that in the villages, majority of the land is under the control of people belonging to one specific caste groups. Hota hai? Agree or not? So this specific caste group is there which is having the overall control over the land. While there are other smaller caste groups which basically work for the landlord. Or that is how it has been in the past. Today it might be changing. But in the past, This is how the castes were working in an integrated fashion, where the smaller caste groups were working for the caste groups which were seen as the landholders or majority of the landholders in the village. Yes, this system was then named as the Jajmani system. This system was named as what? Jajmani system. This system was known as the Jajmani system, which means what? Which means that there were certain castes which were the land-owning castes, number one, which were influential castes, which were the center of all the activity in the village. And there were other castes which were termed as the service castes. Right? While the ones who were the receiver of these services, they were called as jajmans. तो अभी भी जब आपने देखा होगा, the priest, when the priest performs the function, he performs the function for the jajman. होता yajman, jajman, the words that are used. They use the word term. Agree or not? In this Jajmani system, Jajman was the center of the activity, and the service castes used to provide the service to the Jajman. Term used for the Jajmans was Jajmans, while for the service caste, it was Kamins. Mostly these service castes belong to what? So-called low caste groups. So in the day-to-day usage, you might be knowing that this Kamins has become a abuse itself. The origin of this term that you use in your daily life is from here. Jajmans and the Kamins, which was a very commonly used word in the Bollywood. Right? But it had caste underpinnings. It began from there. So what the whole idea was, to explain any topic in anthropology or in any other optional subject or discipline, this kind of nuanced understanding is required. Right? Questions will be there related to these concepts: Jati model, WNA model, book view, field view, Jajmani system. There will be proponents who will say that Jajmani system is a very well functioning system. It is based on the idea of reciprocity, because although the service caste might be providing service to the Jajmans, the Jajman also has certain obligations toward these service castes. ऐसा नहीं जजमान सिर्फ सर्विस लेकर चिल कर रहा है, नहीं है. The Jajman also has certain obligations towards these service castes. Right? So it was portrayed as if it is functioning like a very well-oiled machinery in the village. Right? They did not talk about the exploitative system under the caste system, under the Jajmani system, which actually is found at the rural level. Okay? So that's the whole point, that whatever we study here, whatever we study in an optional subject is or has to be studied in this fashion, where you need to know the nuanced understanding. You need to know who have talked about what. For example, Indologists, initial ones were Risley's. Risley who was a British administrator. There were people like G.S. Ghurye, right? In the field view, there are people like M.N. Srinivas, S.C. Dubey. For example, Jajmani system, it was studied by William Weiser. So there are so many thinkers that we need to quote while highlighting any aspect. To highlight, let's say, the exploitative system under the Jajmani system, there are thinkers like Gloria Goodwin. So you'll have to quote all of them while writing the answers in the exam. ये चीज समझनी होगी. Right? You cannot go on writing about a commonsensical understanding of these phenomena. That is not required. That is not going to fetch you good marks. Whenever you write anything, it has to be substantiated by the argument provided by a thinker. Majority of the times. In some cases, you might not get thinkers, but in majority of the cases, you'll find thinkers who have talked about one aspect of the other. Okay? So whenever we study the optional subject, this is the approach that we follow. Okay? Now the books that we need to refer to. I'll give you a list of the books. सारी आज खरीदना मत. ऐसा होता है टेंडेंसी कि आज ही सब पढ़ लेंगे. It's a long journey. UPSC optional सबसे लंबा होता है किसी भी जनरल स्टडी सब्जेक्ट के सबके कंपैरिजन में. First thing is that, right? You need to invest a lot of time in mastering this subject. So focus on self-study also after going home from these classes. उसके बिना काम नहीं चल पाएगा. हाँ कि ना? तुम लोग क्या सोच रहे थे कि बस कम पॉइंट्स याद करके चले जाएंगे? छोटा सब्जेक्ट है एंथ्रोपोलॉजी, तो हो जाएगा काम. ये सोच के कौन कौन आया कि सब्जेक्ट बहुत छोटा है? एक भैया थे, वो IAS बन गए। उन्होंने बोला कि सब्जेक्ट बहुत छोटा है। कोई भी सब्जेक्ट छोटा नहीं भाई, एवरी सब्जेक्ट इज इक्वली। किसने बोला? अक्षर जैन। क्या बोला उन्होंने? उनको कितने अटेम्प्ट लगे और कितने टाइम पढ़ा उन्होंने? नोबडी रिवील्स। क्योंकि एक थॉरो अंडरस्टैंडिंग, कई बार समटाइम्स यू गेट लकी कि इस बार प्री हो गया और एंथ्रोपोलॉजी भर दिया था फॉर्म में और अब कोई ऑप्शन नहीं है। फिर जब आप अपनी जान के लिए भागते हो, पीछे शेर आ ही रहा है, अब दौड़ने के अलावा कोई ऑप्शन नहीं है, तब कई बार क्लिक कर जाता है। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, देयर वाज अ स्टूडेंट अभिषेक दवाचिया। ठीक है, अभिषेक दवाचिया केम आफ्टर प्रीलिम्स। प्रीलिम्स क्लियर हो गया, कॉलेज से जस्ट पास आउट हुए थे 1 साल पहले ही। घर बैठ के तैयारी करी पूरी, सोशियोलॉजी की कोई 2-4 किताब हाथ लग गई, वहां से पढ़ ली, किसी के नोट्स मिल गए, हाथ पढ़ लिए, प्री हो गया। अब समझ नहीं आ रहा मेंस में क्या करना है। अब जब 1.5-2 महीने ही बचे हैं, तो क्या राय दोगे आप उसको कि भाई जो बेयर मिनिमम हो सकता है वो कर लो? और उसमें से भी कुछ लर्निंग्स हैं। बेयर मिनिमम इज कि जितने PYQs हैं उनके मॉडल आंसर बना लो, जो भी नोट्स है उनको देख के। ये काम कर सकते हो मेजोरिटी, इससे ज्यादा तो क्या कर लोगे? 2 महीने में इससे ज्यादा टाइम होने है नहीं कि तुम बैठ के किताबें। ही हैड सम अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ द सब्जेक्ट क्योंकि उसने थोड़ा बहुत खुद से पढ़ लिया। What he did is, in the intervening period between the prelims and the mains, he wrote all the previous year questions. उसको लगा और तो कुछ हो नहीं सकता है, कम से कम ये तो कर लो, अगले अटेम्प्ट में काम आ जाएंगे। He did this. उनको याद करे, रट लिए, समझ लिया और एग्जाम में लिखाया। पेपर 1 में 171 नंबर आ गए 250 में से। ट्रू स्टोरी है, मिलवा सकता हूं उससे। 171 मार्क्स, क्योंकि उस वक्त उसके पास सोचने का टाइम नहीं था। गो फॉर द किल कि ये है, ये कर लेते हैं, बट इट माइट नॉट वर्क फॉर एवरीबडी। तो इससे हमें क्या लेसन मिल रहा है कि PYQs की बहुत इंपॉर्टेंस है। PYQs are very, very important for preparing the subject properly. So while we are going to study in this class, any topic that we study, once the topic is over, I'll give you an assignment. Once the topic is over, I'll give you an assignment. 10, 15, 5, 20 questions. क्या हो गया? चिंता होगी? एग्जाम भी तो सिविल सर्विस है। हाँ तो करना मेहनत, सैटरडे संडे को मेहनत कर लेना। यही नहीं कहूंगा कि अगले ही दिन लिख के लाना। एंड व्हाट आई एम टेलिंग यू टू डू इज कि एक बार वो टॉपिक पढ़ा, once you study that in the class, you have taken notes in the class, you have gone through some of the basic books, then you write the answers to those PYQs by looking into these notes. Impromptu writing you should not do in the beginning in any optional subject. Stands true for anthropology also. You do an open book answer writing, कि पहले देख के तो अपना टैलेंट निकालें कि हम लिख क्या सकते हैं, क्योंकि जब देख के लिखेंगे तब कंटेंट बहुत ज्यादा होगा, उसको कंसोलिडेट करना पड़ेगा। एंड व्हाट यू राइट इन योर ओन expression, that is what you are going to remember in the examination. इसीलिए people emphasize on answer writing. अक्षर जैन जो तुम बोल रहे हो, जो किताब उन्होंने लिखी है, किताब कहां से लिखी उन्होंने? PYQ खुद के लिखे थे उसने? हम क्या करते हैं, उनके PYQ याद करके जाना चाहते हैं एग्जाम में। हम अपने PYQ नहीं बनाना चाहते। वो PYQ बनाने में कितने एफर्ट गई होगी? What was the effort that was required in writing those PYQ books by the Akshar Jain? It was a long journey, and he might have invested considerable time in doing this exercise. If he had all these PYQs ready, maybe the ones that he published in the books were more than what he might have prepared for himself. No doubt about it, because it's a formal publication that has come out. But you see the topper's notes also. Mandar part ki, kisi ke bhi notes utha lo. You'll find that these notes are very, very elaborate. They have tried to write everything on their own after going through the notes of whatever things they have studied, or from whichever teacher they have studied. Right? Because what you write on your own after thinking a lot is what sticks into your mind. That is what gets internalized. Once that gets internalized, it is easy to reproduce in the examination. It is easy to reproduce in the examination. Yes or no? So let's take up a list of books that we need to refer to. Okay? In the initial part, we'll be going slow. I will recommend you to study these basic books. First is your, of course, the SCRT books. SCRT books, the beautiful thing about these books is 11th and 12th class, available online. Take a printout of them. Take a printout of these two books. Okay? Go topic by topic. Do not try to understand everything in the first reading. Read it like a novel. First reading has to be pretty casual so that you know or have an idea about the discipline anthropology. And the beauty about this book is it is way better, very well written as compared to any other NCRT that you have for any optional for that matter. Very structured in nature. It is in line with our syllabus also. So some of the very smaller topics for which you do not find anything, sometimes they can be answered through the SCRT book also. So that is an intangible benefit that you have. For example, language as a topic that is there. Some of the things that are given here will be asked directly in the examination, like questions. That is the importance of the SCRT books. So initial reading has to be of the SCRT books. I expect every one of you to complete these books in next 10 days. कहानी की तरह पढ़ना है, novel. Word by word of meaning, if you start following, you yourself will be stuck here. And that is not the best way to study any book. Because comprehension is a different phenomena. What is comprehension? Broader idea. If I show you a movie by muting it, you'll be able to understand the key idea in that movie. तब भी समझ जाओगे तुम acting देख के. होता है कि नहीं होता है? Are we not able to understand the movie without even listening to the audio? Agree? That is what is comprehension. You get the first idea about that thing. Minor details and nuances are for later part. But in the beginning, anybody who is starting, please go through these books in the first 10 days at least. Go at a very fast speed, at a very rapid pace, because if you go slowly, you miss out on the larger idea of the book. Any book that you study, why do you find reading novels comfortable and not the textbooks? Which was the last novel that you read? Anybody? उसने पढ़ी है कोई किताब? या inherently book reading is not my hobby? Do you remember each and every concept that has been discussed in that novel? But you have the larger idea of that novel, no doubt. So that is what is expected out of this novel reading right now. In novel reading nahi hai, but because we will be acquainted with most of these ideas in the initial part, it will help us in developing a broader understanding later. For example, I start with the terms right directly. I start throwing terms at you. And then it will be, you yourself will be puzzled. What is happening? Right? So to get that broad idea, first book is your Kerala State SCRT. Second, when we go topic by topic, when we'll start topic by topic, the second book that we'll refer to is your Amber and Amber. Second book that we need to refer to is your Amber and Amber. Fine. Then there is a typical problem in theories in anthropology. Theories is one of the important aspects of the anthropology. And the books that have been written for the theory are some of the worst books that you will find. They are so difficultly written that it is very, very difficult to understand from those books. Okay? Although we are going to refer to some of them for some aspects, but we are not going to follow them blindly. What we are going to do is we are going to understand them thoroughly in the class. We are going to take notes. And through this understanding, we are going to write and come up with our answers for the exam. Okay? Because that is one of the cliched area that is most important, and that is the least done or not very well written books are there on the theory. There are books like Makhanja, Gaya and Upadhyay. Makhanja is although a bit simpler book, but Gaya and Upadhyay is so complex that it becomes really difficult to understand, at least for the beginners. After a point, you get to understand some of the ideas once you have understood everything. So Gaya and Upadhyay will buy, but at a later stage. Okay? Then there are two Indian anthropology books. These are must-haves. Then slowly and steadily, whatever will be required, I'll keep on telling you. These have been written by Nadeem Hasnain, who is an anthropology professor. Nadeem Hasnain. He has written 3 books. वैसे तो बहुत सारी लिखी हैं, but the first one is Indian Anthropology. Second is Tribal Anthropology. And third is General Anthropology. tribal, Indian, and general anthropology. Right? Most of your paper 2 syllabus has been included in these 2 books, but it gives you a very basic understanding only. We need to develop upon that. ठीक है? Nadeem Hasnan, Indian, tribal, and general anthropology. ठीक है? These are the basic books. Then there are other sources, like we have IGNU. Then we have what? EPG, Pathshala. ठीक है? But these need to be used very sparingly, selectively, because these are so elaborate that you might be lost in these. If you go through these sources, they are very, very elaborate. ठीक है? Most of the things that I'll teach you in the class, I have incorporated majority of the topics from these 2 sources. I've incorporated all the viewpoints that are there in these topics. So need not worry about them. You need to buy the first 3 ones and some validation if it is required. I've already tried to incorporate them in the notes. Whatever notes I'm going to give you in the class, whatever explanations I'm going to give you in the class, whatever handouts I'm going to give you in the class, we have taken references from these books. ठीक है? Broadly, the way in which you search any topic related to IGNO is just to write the name of that topic and then write IGNO. The PDF will be out. It is very well written in the story format also. So sometimes you can do this exercise, but not very regularly. It will not be possible for you to do every time. ठीक है? In general, these are the broad resources that you need to refer to. Now you might have the question, physical anthropology, why not Pinath? Pinath is the book that you might have heard about from everybody. सुना है कि नहीं सुना है? नहीं सुना है? अच्छा किया. Well done. Because that is, again, a very complicated book, number one. Complicated in the sense, the story is not coherent in that. Anthropology unfolds like a story if you look at it. If you have seen some of the orientation lectures, I've talked about how the anthropology as a discipline unfolds, some of which we are going to discuss today also. Okay? But that story part is missing in the physical anthropology. The biggest problem that you face in correlating the topics is in the physical anthropology. Every topic looks like an isolated topic, which everybody thinks that there is no coherence. These are not related to each other. While in social culture, there is far more coherence. And Pinath, because it is not a core anthropology book, it has been written by not an anthropologist. That is why he has lost the track of the coherence in that book. So for physical anthropology, the majority of the parts will be referring from the amber and amber. Right? But what we are going to study in this class is not just from amber and amber. It has been taken from majority of the standard textbooks in anthropology, like Larson Essentials. It is a book that is published in Stanford. All of these books I have referred to be able to explain it properly. One thing is that for theory and theory, there is a very standard textbook that is taught in Texas University, and that is McGee and Worms. पर आपको इनको बिल्कुल नहीं खोलना है, क्योंकि वो खोला तो फिर समंदर है. It's an ocean. Then there is no limit. That is why you have joined the coaching. If you had to do it on your own, it would have become a very difficult task. And plus, you do not have any background in this discipline. Right? So that becomes a problem. First thing is we are going to read the basic books. At least start with this. Sapiens, if you want to study, it can be out of your interest. It can be your bedtime book. कि थोड़ा थोड़ा अगर पढ़ लिए तो बहुत ही बढ़िया है. If you have not studied it, you can start it out of interest to understand the narrative of anthropology as to how anthropology should be perceived in the first place. How exactly do we understand the nature of the discipline? And he has narrated it like a story, especially the first initial parts that he explains there. Got it? Second thing that we are going to do is what? First is your book reading. Second thing is your assignments. Second thing is assignments, which will be mostly PYQs. Right? Which have to be written how? Open book. in the form of what? Model answers. Model answers means it should have almost all the aspects related to that topic, because now you have already studied the topic, you have understood it in the class, you have taken notes in the class. So you have to write those PYQs in the form of assignment that I'm going to give you, her topic pe. Because that is what is going to be the thing that you are going to actually remember in the examination. And majority of the questions tend to be repeated from the PYQs. That is a very good thing about anthropology. Maybe in a bit different form, but in general, the questions, the nature of the question remains the same. They're broadly asked in a similar fashion every time. Some questions, no doubt, they keep on changing, but broadly, this has been the theme in anthropology. This has been the way in which the questions have been asked. That is what makes it a bit more predictable as compared to other options. That is one of the pros of this optional subject. But only if you have understood everything, you will be able to write the model answers properly. Model answers, or at least the answers to the PYQs, right? Once you have written a basic outline of the answer, answer means proper answer. If the requirement of the question was 250 words, you write it in 300 words. Take your space, no problem in that. Write 350 words. Because some of the information you're going to lose out when you're going to write it in the tests. Okay? Once this is done, this will be your first primary revision material. Whatever topics were not there, because some of the questions might not have been asked in the PYQs, and it is also not possible to cover almost all the topics through these questions. So for those topics, you're going to again refer to the notes. Okay? After doing this, you then take up the tests. Only once you have done this, you take up the tests. Without this exercise, there is no point of taking the test directly after studying. क्योंकि टेस्ट दोगे 100 में से 20 नंबर आएंगे, दुखी होगे और पढ़ाई छोड़ दोगे. If you take the test randomly without going into the details of the subject, without going through this exercise of PYQ, because what happens is if you have to write an answer, you will be required to engage with the topic. The requirement will be that you will have to fight with that topic. कि क्या लिखना है भाई, शुरू कहां से करना है, पहले तो वहीं चैलेंज आएगा. So this exercise is a very, very important exercise. This is like doing the homework in the school. होमवर्क करते थे स्कूल में, टीचर ने चैप्टर पढ़ा, क्योंकि एग्जाम भी बोर्ड एग्जाम ही है, बस थोड़ा बड़ा बोर्ड एग्जाम है कि नहीं? This is like a board exam only. You study so many subjective things, write down question answers, learn them, and then go to the exam, go to the actual test. Okay? This is the theme that we are going to follow here in the classroom. Book reading is a must. Whatever chapter I teach in the class, I'll ask you to read them from the books. Keep पढ़ के आओ. One thing you'll have to study. You'll need to have a broader understanding so that we can have a proper conversation and we can understand it in wholity. Okay? That is necessary thing that is required here. Right? Everybody clear with this idea, phenomena? People of online, I'll share the PDFs on the e-learn platform. You can take it from there. Whatever reading is required beyond these books and resources, I'll also give you that in the form of the PDFs for the online people. Offline people will take a printout from here. ठीक है, यहाँ पे मिल जाएगा. At the center, you'll get the copy of that. Fine. You'll always keep the syllabus handy. And I'll also give you a list of PYQs in the topic-wise format. Every point of the syllabus and what are the questions that have been asked in the past 10 to 15 to 20 years. Right? That will give you understanding of what is the nature of the questions that is asked in these topics. Perfect. Now let's start with some historical background of anthropology. Or how has the discipline evolved over a period of time? No need to write. अभी बस समझेंगे इसको. We'll start the formal, क्योंकि अभी you are not even introduced to the subject, what this discipline is all about. You do not even know what are the different aspects and facets of the discipline. Okay? So just we are going to go through a glimpse of the historical background. We'll discuss it, Sanidhya, once the class is over, the modern way in which the material can be sent to you. ठीक है? Now you see, all of these subjects that we study today, all of the disciplines that we study today, they have their birth in the 16th and the 17th century, or some of them in 17th and 18th century, right? So it will be true to say that most of the disciplines that we study today are new disciplines. They have some sort of background in the previous disciplines that existed, but these are the disciplines that have born out of an important phenomena, that is Renaissance in the European society. Majority of the disciplines that you study today, political science, social science, your sociology, your anthropology, right, psychology, all of these disciplines have been a result of one important current of thought that started in the European society, and that is called as what? Renaissance. What exactly did happen during the Renaissance? It's an event, but if you look at the phenomena as such, what exactly was happening during Renaissance was, the period before Renaissance was known as the medieval ages and were also termed as the Dark Ages. Why Dark Ages? Because the church or the religion had extreme control over the social life. The church or the religion had the extreme control over the social life in the medieval period in Europe, right? So a current of thought started to come up where they started questioning the religion and its control over the humanity. They started doing what? They started questioning the control of the religion over the society. And the important outcome of this was, people started to believe that religion cannot explain all the phenomena. And a shift that was found was that man should be the center of the discourse. Man, now we use it as a metaphorical term because it was used initially for representing the whole of humanity. The terms like mankind. Now we use a more gender neutral term, that is human beings. Right? So what happened during the Renaissance is man became the center of the discourse. And they started believing in the immense potential and abilities of the man during this period. And this was facilitated by the rediscovery of the ancient Greek and Roman texts, in which they found that the religion's control was not that great in the Greek and the Roman society. They found what? That the influence of the religion on the society was not that great in the Greek and the Roman society. So this gave them the confidence again, self-belief. For example, in India's case, in the nationalist movement, majority of the people went to what? The ancient classical texts like Arthashastra, Vedas. Arya Samaj gave the slogan back to Vedas because they found that the problems that you face in the society today, in the caste system, are a beginning of the medieval period. While in the ancient period, the Varna system was functioning beautifully according to them. Right? That is why Dayanand Saraswati gave the famous slogan back to Vedas. Let's reinstate the caste system in its original form, according to him. Agree? So all these phenomena that happened during the Renaissance period led to a position which led to the belief that man should be the center of the discourse, and man has immense potentials and abilities. And this started to be reflected in whatever things that were being done at that time. This philosophy, underlying philosophy, was reflected in almost every sphere of the life. For example, the architecture started to change. For example, the paintings that were drawn, they started to change. Because earlier, everything was religion-oriented. The architecture had to have a religious basis, or the paintings had to have a religious basis. That started to change here. Why? Because man became the center of the discourse. What this led to is because people started to believe in their ability, right? And this was a period when there were centers of trade that were flourishing in the European society, especially in Italy, in the cities like Genoa, Florence, Venice. There were traders who had started believing in these ideas, and they started questioning the ideas that were propounded by the church or by the religion, right? This sense of belief that started in the European society led to a period which is called as the age of exploration. Led to what? Period which is called as age of exploration. And that is when the Europeans started to search for different ways to reach the eastern countries like India and China, which were the biggest trading partners of the Europe at that time. They started to do what? Search for alternative routes. So that is why all the famous ship journeys started in those times for the discovery of these lands. Why do we say that India was discovered by Vasco da Gama? India was already discovered in itself. Vasco da Gama only discovered it for the Europeans, a new route for the Europeans, sea route for the Europeans. Columbus also started the journey, but he reached at a different place, that is Americas. Right? Columbus did the same thing, but he reached at a different place and he called it as America. Right? So this was associated with the age of exploration. Right? What was the consequence of this was this age of exploration and the new routes and the new journeys that the people began from the Europe was that the people, when they started moving into different areas like India, like Africa, like America, they encountered people who were different from the Europeans. They encountered people who were radically different from the Europeans. Because not everybody had that broad perspective. Only a few people had met Indians before. Right? So this led to a very difficult position in the European society as to how to understand these different cultures or these people who look different, who have different practices, who have different rituals, different norms, different values. How to understand them? What to make out of them? What exactly is happening here? Why do we find people who are very different from them? And they had to explain these phenomena. Agree? So this is how the story began. Then what happened is, Renaissance later gave rise to a period which is called as the Age of Enlightenment, right? Or the age of science, the age of reason, the age of questioning. In the 17th and the 18th century, this is known as the Age of Enlightenment, the age of science, the age of reason, when people started to want empirical evidence for the things that were happening. That led to the birth of the sciences everywhere. Right? In this period, what was happening is, in the same period, we find that in the later part, capitalism started to become an important way in which the economies were governed. Capitalism started to become an important way in which the economies were governed. Right? This capitalism, ultimately, the feudalism was ending. The monarchy was ending in some cases. But the mode of production then shifted towards capitalism. This facilitated industrial revolution along with the developments in the science. Along with the development of the science. This led to what? Industrial revolution. Capital, science led to the industrial revolution. An offshoot of this was colonization. Because to breed industrial revolution, they needed raw material. Countries started or embarked upon this journey of colonization in different parts of the world, including India, including Africa, including Americas. Right? This industrial revolution brought about rapid changes in the European society itself. What this led to? The industrial revolution led to rapid changes in the European society itself. For example, what we are seeing today in our society, what we are seeing today in our society is that everybody is focusing upon the market economy today. Today we have is what? A market economy. And whatever change comes up in technology and the modes of production, we find a consequent impact on the society also. Right? For example, we are finding that families are becoming nuclear. What we find in our society is that people are migrating from their native places into the urban places. The notions about the family, the notions about the marriage, new forms of marriage are coming up. They are changing or not? Yes, all of these things we are finding what? That these things are changing in our society also. Similar thing was witnessed by the European society back then when the Industrial Revolution started, because people started to migrate from the villages into the urban areas. Urbanization became a phenomenon. Right? And people started to say that the urban life felt more free. The city air feels free. These were the terms that were used for the urban life at that time. Right? So changes were being witnessed in the European society as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. And how to study these changes, what to make of these changes, that became a discipline which is called as sociology. What was that discipline called? Sociology. The discipline that emerged to understand the changes that were coming up in the European society because of the Industrial Revolution came to be known as sociology. Thinkers like Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, they tried to understand the changes that were coming up in the European society. For example, Emile Durkheim tried to understand suicide as a phenomena that was happening in the European society. And his famous work is known as Suicide. And he gave an explanation as to what was changing actually because of the changes that were coming up. He contrasted the changes in the society with the already existing phenomena in the society. Right? So that is why sociology began as a discipline to study what? The European society. Who was studying the European society? The Europeans themselves. Right? So your sociology as a discipline began as a study of own cultures. While we find that people had already embarked upon a journey right after the Renaissance, and a consequence was colonization in the later stages, which was also associated with the Industrial Revolution in the European society, which led to large-scale migration from the Europe into these places to govern these places, to economically work in these places. Right? And they encountered people who were extremely different from their own people. They encountered people who were extremely different from the ones that they have seen in the Europe. They saw that their practices and rituals are absolutely different from what they're pursuing back home. For example, they went into certain areas and found that the people who are practicing marriage, there is a phenomenon called as polygamy. Right? When they came to India, they found a new phenomenon. They thought that there is a phenomenon called as joint family. Right? So they found that in different parts of the world, you find so many differences now. Not just culture, not just in terms of the behaviors or the rituals or the institutions. You find physical differences also. They have different colors, skin colors, different hair type, different height and stature, different types of eyes. They found these differences. So as a result, anthropology is then defined as the study of, or began as the study of what? The other cultures. How did the anthropology begin? It began as the study of other cultures, while sociology began with the study of what? The own cultures. That is the primary basis of anthropology. And what they are trying to understand through these other cultures are the differences that are there in the world. Whatever differences you find, why do you find different places to be different? In terms of rituals, in terms of how the people look, in terms of how the houses are built, in terms of the food that they are eating. Why are so many differences there? They went on, they started to explain, ki ho kya raha hai? Why exactly are you finding this thing? That is why anthropology began as a discipline to study what? These other cultures, which were encountered by the Europeans. And Europeans wanted to explain these phenomena that were happening. Broadly, this is the beginning of the anthropology. Right? Now, it was not a new phenomena that was happening. It will be wrong to say that nobody had encountered different cultures before them. There were people who had encountered different people, and they went on to describe these different people. And there are records that are found. Let's say Yun Sang came to India. Did he not find people different from his own culture? Did he not find? He might have also written an account of the Indian society. What exactly is happening? right? Marco Polo went on to a journey into the East, and he has also written the Adventures of Marco Polo. Right or wrong? So they have also written certain accounts, like the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. He has written about India, or he has written about the people he encountered in different parts of the world. He has written about them. Megasthenes has wrote something about Indian society. So we find that this was a phenomena that had already been existing. This question of being able to explain the different societies has always been there, but it was accentuated, it was expedited by the phenomena called as colonialism. When the explorers, when the European countries started to colonize these different people, and they wanted to explain these cultures that they found that which were extremely different. So the primary goal of anthropology was to explain the other cultures, and by explaining these other cultures, they were indirectly doing what? Explaining the differences and the diversity that you find in the societies across the globe. They started with this thought. Right? Now, how to explain these phenomena? What was the prominent thought at that time? What was the prominent thought to explain these other cultures? Right? Or the differences. How do you explain them? Religion, although, was still an important way of thinking at that time. Although people started to believe in themselves, they still believed in some sort of some of the religious ideas to be able to explain the world. Right? And one of the theories that was a religious theory that explained the differences is called as degenerationism. What is it called? The theory of degenerationism. What does it mean? They said that initially all of the humanity, this theory is based on the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Right? This theory said that all of the humanity belonged to only single civilization. There was only one civilization, and whole of humanity belonged to this civilization. Right? In this, they had come up with a book which is called as the Book of Genesis. The Book of Genesis, which is what? A book which explains how the world came to be. हर religion में एक story होती है कि दुनिया कैसे बनी. Hinduism also has its own set of stories how the world was created. Right? Brahmaji created this history. And all these myths we also have, they also had their myths. Right? So this Book of Genesis is nothing but a origin myth that has been written. Isme there is a story in which they wrote that a tower was constructed. The Tower of Babel. This was constructed, which represented almost all the humanity. These were people who belonged to the same civilization. Right? But what happened is the God had destructed this Tower of Babel. मान लो ये tower बनाया, and this tower was destructed by the God, which led to what? Which led to throwing away of some of the humanity into different directions. Religious story है तो religious type ही होगी वो. It is bound to be a story of sorts. So what they said is when this was destructed, it led to throwing away of different pieces into different directions. Right? And the original ones that remained behind, were, according to them, the most superior ones, the most civilized ones. While the ones that were thrown away in the far places, they had degenerated. They had what? Degenerated into what is called as the primitive cultures. How the theorizing started in anthropology. Initially, this was the belief at that point of time, that the destruction of the Tower of the Babel led to throwing away of different peoples into different directions. And the ones that were thrown away into distant places had then degenerated into what were termed as the primitive cultures. Right? The Europeans also had this notion of the superiority of themselves. They had assumed that we are the most developed civilization or the most developed culture to that extent. Agree? This was the initial thought. This theory was known as what? Degenerationism. But of course, it cannot explain everything. For example, when these people started to move into different directions, when the Europeans started to colonize different countries, of course, they found cultures which were different from them, right? But they also found flora and fauna, which was very, very different from the one that is found in the Europe or what was mentioned in the Old Testament or in the Bible. By consequence of this was what? When they started to move around across places, they found that the flora and fauna is extremely different. It is new flora and fauna that you find. Okay, how to explain this now? It was not even mentioned there. आदमियों का तो समझ में आता है. That people were belonging to humanity, that is fine. But what about the flora and fauna? Which was not even mentioned there, it has been found in different places. How to explain this? Initially, Carl Linnaeus, who created the taxonomy of arranging the plant and the animal world into a classification based on the similarities and the differences, grouping them into certain categories. He said that in his the first thing that he published was Systema Naturae in 1735. In that, he had published that the main task of biology, God has created everything. But what is the task of biology is to just classify them into a proper structure, depending upon the similarities and the differences. Okay? This was their understanding. They thought that nobody has created the diversity on the planet. They found that flora and fauna is different. They rationalized this by saying what? That God has created, this diversity is there, but what is our task is just to classify them into the plant kingdom, animal kingdom, and depending upon the similarities into orders, suborders, genus, species, etc. Fine. Later, when these colonizers, they embarked upon the journey, and at the same time, they were doing so many construction activities because industrial revolution had started. They started in these excavations, various fossils and antiquities. Unko milne laga. And they found these antiquities to be very, very different from the ones that were mentioned in the Bible. Had Bible had any basis or the events that Bible had narrated, they were nowhere to be found. When they excavated for the construction purposes, they found that there is nothing similar to the one that was mentioned in the Bible. They wanted to explain that. Right? Plus, they found that some of these remains or the antiquities of the mankind, they are found in association with certain animals, certain types of animals or mammals. What we today study in the archaeology, it began as this only. What we study today in archaeology began in this fashion only, where these antiquities had to be rationalized, that why are they found here? Right? And they started questioning the religious ideas at back then. Right? Then came your Buffon, who again tried to explain that these fossils that you find, these are nothing but extinct species, which have died and which do not survive today. Some of these fossils that you are finding are the extinct species on this planet. And again, he tried to explain the extinct species through the idea of degenerationism, that many of them had vanished, and that is why we find few species to be extinct, and many of them are diverse in nature. Only when Charles Darwin embarked upon his journey on his ship HMS Beagle, and when he started seeing the differences and observing the differences, he came out with his theory of the evolution, where he for the first time questioned the idea of what? For the first time, he questioned the idea that God is not the creator. There is a different process which is called as natural selection, because of which the species have been created on this planet, because of which certain species go extinct, while the other species, they keep on evolving every now and then. There's a continuous evolution process that is going on. Right? So he came up with this idea of what? Evolution. And what is evolution? If I ask you anything, ask you what is evolution? Have you not evolved from your childhood? Who has not evolved? Have you not evolved from the childhood? What is a common understanding about evolution is it is something that refers to progressive change. Progressive change that keeps on going on. Right? So that is a very common understanding of the evolution. For example, the Indian Constitution has evolved in the last 75 years. Right? The technology has evolved in the last 200 years. It is what? It is a progress. It is progressive change that is happening. So another school of thought that started along with the Darwin's idea was progressivism against the degenerationism ideas. What was the idea that developed? It was progressivism. Progressivism. Because it was based on the idea of progress, that things evolve, they change. There is a progressive change. It led to the origin of the progressivism. Right? And it is wrong to say that Darwin was the originator of this idea. Even before him, in the school of philosophies, the idea had already taken its roots. Idea had already taken its roots. For example, and the whole point was that they were not following the line of the degenerationists. The whole idea was what? They were not following the line of the degenerationists. They were saying that the human beings have the capability of progressing. For example, John Locke, one of the political scientists, one of the important philosophers in political science, he said that human mind is like a blank slate. Human mind is like a blank slate, right? And whatever these humans learn, they learn by being a member of that particular society, right? So the idea of degeneration was questionable at that time. And the differences that you see in the society, according to John Locke, was what? Because people have been nurtured and reared into different societies. That is why you find these differences across the globe. That is why you find different cultures. That was John Locke. What he was actually doing was questioning the degenerationist idea, that this explanation of degeneration, that these primitive cultures at one point of time were part of this civilization, but they have degenerated into the backwardness, into the primitive stages. Agree? There was Herbert Spencer. There was Herbert Spencer. Another thinker who is known for the idea of progressivism, right? And he had started using this term of the survival of the fittest that you find today being used by Darwin himself. The term that is used today by in the Darwin's context, or normally associated with Darwin, he was the one he started using this term, survival of the fittest. And his ideas were embedded in the idea of progressivism. What his ideas were, he said that there is a constant struggle for existence that is going on. There is a constant struggle for existence that is going on. Right? And only those who are the fittest will survive in the near future. So what he's saying is what? That there is a conflict, continuous struggle that is going on, and there is a progressive change that is going to happen because of this struggle. It tends to justify what? Sometimes this philosophy we find in the day-to-day life also, where we find people justifying that the conflict that you are finding right now, the struggle that you are facing right now is for your betterment only. जैसे कि आप यूपीएससी की तैयारी कर रहे हो, struggle कर रहे हो, right? This struggle is only because it will lead to progress ultimately. The struggle is ultimately going to lead to what? Progress. So these ideas had already been there. In fact, Darwin himself had taken the term survival of the fittest, which was once used by Herbert Spencer. Right? So the initial school of thought in the anthropology began from these ideas that were already existing in the schools of philosophy. The initial schools of thought in anthropology began from these ideas that were already existing in the philosophical sphere. And this was the idea of evolution, the idea of progressivism. And that is why, to be able to explain the differences in the societies, anthropology has developed various theories. To explain the differences scientifically, the anthropology has developed various theories to be able to explain these ideas. And the first school of thought in anthropology is called as the evolutionism. What is it called? The evolutionism. Evolutionism, to be able to explain the differences in the world in terms of the cultures. Prominent thinkers of this time, who are termed as the pioneer anthropologists, these are E.B. Tyler, E.B. Tyler, and Lewis Henry Morgan. These evolutionists, they had talked about what? The theory of evolution, to be able to explain what? The diversity and the differences that you find around the world in terms of culture. Agree? They were also inquiring into the same things. But what they did differently is they relied on some amount of data to be able to come up at some conclusion. They deployed certain methods to be able to come up at any conclusion. For example, Herbert Spencer did not rely on any data. He just came up with his explanation based on his understanding of whatever he had observed. He did not follow a very scientific process of data gathering. That is why his work is although attributed for having some influence over the evolutionist ideas in the beginning. But he did not deploy the same rigors that were deployed by the later anthropologists. Right? What these anthropologists who belong to the evolutionism school, like your Lewis Henry Morgan and E.B. Tyler, did is, because already so many Europeans had went into these colonies. They were already administering these countries. And they had recorded so many things on their own. They sent them questionnaires and they asked them to write about some of the practices in their areas in which they were ruling. And they got hands on this second-hand information from the administrators across the globe, Americas, India, everywhere, Africa. They got what? This information. They deployed a process, and then they started coming up with certain ideas to explain the diversity. They got their hand on what? This second-hand data. And this data then was used. The data is nothing without an explanation. So this explanation was then provided in the form of the first theory that is called as the theory of the evolution. How did the theory of the evolution explain the differences in the society? E.B. Tyler, his famous work is known as, the name of his work is Primitive Culture itself. What is the name of his work? Primitive Culture. While Henry Morgan, L.H. Morgan, he came out with his pioneering work that is called as Ancient Society. Everybody following till now? From degenerationism to progressivism as an idea which had already existed was then deployed by the later anthropologists, beginning with the school of theory of evolutionism, to explain the differences, to understand these other cultures that had been encountered by the Europeans. And they developed various methods and ways in which to understand these other cultures. Right? Pioneer in this field were E.B. Tyler and L.H. Morgan. Through this, you'll be able to grasp the different strands in anthropology, and then when we one by one study them, it will not be very difficult for you to understand. Now, once this story is clear to you, it will make your life a bit easy when we actually study them in a bit more detail. Right? So what the evolutionists said in the beginning to explain these societies, they said that first they came up with the idea that there are certain societies like their own society, which are the most civilized societies, which are the most civilized societies, right? While the other societies that have been encountered, they are primitive societies. Their own society, they consider to be what? The most civilized one, while the other ones are considered as what? The most primitive societies according to them. And they say that what you find as a difference between these societies is nothing but the stage of evolution in which these societies are. The differences that you find in the societies which are civilized and which are not so civilized societies, according to them, the differences are because they are belonging to different stages of evolution of the human culture. They said that human culture evolves in various stages. And they had also gone on to define these stages. For example, they said that every human culture on the planet goes through these stages. First, they start as savages. Then they progress into becoming barbaric. And lastly, they become civilized. So which means the European society itself has gone through these stages and has reached the ultimate stage of the civilization, and that is called as the civilized state. While what you see in the primitive cultures are that they are still stuck in the first stage, that is the savagery. Savagery means people living in the forests. Savage. Agree? So theory of evolution tried to explain what the difference is, and they came up with a theory by understanding the data that they had got from the questionnaires that they sent to the administrators who were ruling these colonies. Came out with the theory of evolution and said that all the cultures evolved through these stages. What you see as the most civilized cultures today, which according to them was the European culture, had at one point of time been savage. Following? Online? Right? So from here, they have transformed themselves or progressively changed into what? The civilized societies. So the three stages of evolution that they talked about was what? Savagery, barbarism, civilization. And different societies are at different levels of evolution. That is why you find so much differences in the society. Progressive, inspired from the progressive ideas that were already existing, they deployed only the scientific methods to be able to explain this theory, wherein they went on for some data collection. Following? Yes or no? Criteria civilized ka, whatever the European society, the Victorian society, had as its culture, was seen as the highest stage of the civilization. For example, they even explained the institutions in the societies. For example, marriage. They had to explain the idea of marriage, that how marriage as an institution might have evolved. Let's say if the society has evolved, different institutions might have also evolved in the same fashion. If the overall name for the society is termed as what? It is in the savagery state or in barbaric state or in civilized state. Different institutions might have followed the same line. They explained that marriage was non-existent in the savagery stage. It was a stage of promiscuity. Promiscuity means random mating. Marriage today explains what? There are certain rules through which people can marry. You cannot marry randomly today. You cannot mate with the individuals randomly today. In the human beings. Animal world, it is possible. Here, it is not possible. Right? Because we have a society in which we are living. And we mate in a very regularized manner, or it is a regulated manner, thing that is regulated by the society. Right? So they have hypothesized that initially in the savagery stage, people were promiscuous. It was a stage of random mating. This evolved into the secondary stage, into the barbaric period, which was called as polygamy, which ultimately evolved into what they observed in their own society, which is called as what? Monogamy. Promiscuity to polygamy to monogamy. Edward E.B. Tyler talked about religion also, how religion might have evolved, because religion is also a characteristic feature of almost all the societies. When he started talking about these so-called primitive or the savage or the tribal societies, he said that the religion that is followed by them is nothing but animism. Where people worship their nature, right? Or people worship supernatural beings, right? He said that this progressed and evolved into the another stage, which is called as polytheism. That you have pantheons of gods. And ultimately, because they were monotheistic, they claimed and said that our religion is the best or the most evolved or the most civilized one, and which is monotheism. That is only one God, one holy place, one book, one symbol. Abrahamic religions, if you observe, they have only one monotheism. One God is there. Char God का concept ही नहीं है. Do you find the same in the Indian society? No. We are polytheistic. So they use this concept to do this generalization. What is inherent in this generalization? The assumption itself is wrong that you are the most civilized ones. The assumption that you are the most civilized one, while all other are backward or uncivilized itself is a wrong assumption to make. This kind of a view led to a viewpoint of understanding the other cultures, which is called as the ethnocentric view. Ethnocentric view. That is a view that is based, that is conditional on your understanding of the other cultures through your own cultural lens. For example, today, I belong to a particular culture and I try to observe the other cultures. For example, I'm from North India and I start observing South India. I might come up with my ethnocentric ideas that their culture looks a bit different. And people go on to the extent of saying that their culture is weird. People from that side will start seeing the other cultures in the same fashion. So the phenomena where you start seeing the other cultures through your own cultural lens, this kind of an approach is called as an ethnocentric approach. Following? Ethnocentric approach, right? So this is how they tried to explain. They said that all these differences that you find are nothing but the different stages of evolution in which these cultures are. Right? And the only corollary that was there was that these savages also have the potential of becoming civilized. If Europeans themselves have evolved through these stages, the savages or the tribals can also be civilized. This led to the follow-up concepts that were used by the colonial administrators to their own benefit. That we are on a civilizing mission. White man's burden. You have heard about these terms in history. Okay, we are on a civilizing mission. What was the inherent idea? That our civilization is the topmost civilization. The Victorian civilization is the most developed civilization, while the primitive civilizations are the most backward ones. Right? And they also came up with this idea that human beings across the globe think in similar fashions. Their thought process is the same. Right? And in these different places, these cultures have evolved independently. These cultures in different places have evolved independently. For example, if you talk about the different cultures, let's say in Africa, or in India or in Europe, they would say what? That they have evolved independently in these different places. One. Second, the only difference is there are different stages. These these cultures are yet to pass through all these stages. They have been left behind into only one initial stage of the civilization. While Europe is the one which has reached the next level of the civilization, that is the highest level of the civilization. That is called as the civilized state, right? So they say that because the human beings think in the same manner, and even the Europeans have started with the savagery only and have reached the civilized state. They said that man is very inventive in nature. And all of us have the similar capability. Right? And there was no connection whatsoever between these different cultures in the beginning. All of them have developed independently. The underlying idea is that there is psychic unity of mankind, that human thought process is the same everywhere. It is only how that has been utilized in different places that has led to this cultural evolution. The underlying idea is what? Psychic unity of the mankind. And the inherent idea is man is inventive. Wherever you find the different cultures, you find that they have invented it themselves. Because human beings necessarily think in the same manner in different places. That was their underlying assumption. They came up with this idea that is called as psychic unity of mankind. सब कुछ आएगा आगे, no need to worry if it is becoming too heavy. But just giving you a glimpse as to how to get yourself introduced and acquainted with the ideas in anthropology. Okay? Psychic unity of mankind. Then as a criticism to this school, because this school started with its own ideas. People started to criticize them for being ethnocentric. People started to criticize them for what? Criticize them for using irrational ideas like psychic unity of the mankind. Giving some or emphasizing too much on the inventiveness of the mankind. The next school of thought that came up after the evolutionism is called as the diffusionism. Called as what? Diffusionism. Initial, every differences had to be explained through what? Biblical degenerationist ideas. Then there was a philosophy which was focused upon progressivism, which was also there used by Herbert Spencer. Also had taken its roots into the Darwinian philosophy. Darwin also was inspired by some of the ideas that were already existing. Right? For example, the struggle for existence. He had learned it from one of the important thinkers of that time, Thomas Malthus, in his theory of population, that resources are limited, but the population of the humans increases at a greater speed as compared to the increase in the resources. That is why ultimately some people are going to die, no doubt about it. He used scientific terms, but it's a general idea that I want to convey here. Right? So he was inspired from all these ideas. Then came the progressivism as an idea. And then there were certain thinkers who started to deploy these ideas to be able to interpret the data that they had received from these scholars who were in these colonies. And they came out with the theory of evolution, which was premised on the idea that cultures evolve into these stages, through these stages of savagery, barbarism, civilization. Tyler Morgan being the initial thinkers with their works, Primitive Culture and Ancient Society. This was questioned, the inherent inventiveness of the mankind that they said. They said that it is really difficult to comprehend the idea that in every place, people invented their culture differently. It sounds very odd for them. So they came up with another idea, which is called as diffusionism. And they again invoked the idea which is called as degenerationism. Degenerationism. They said that certain things are invented only in some places. And majority of these cultural traits, which are invented at one place, they get diffused into different directions. Diffuse into different directions. into different places. They diffuse from one point where the culture was invented into different dimensions, into different directions. And because of this diffusion, certain traits get degenerated while the others become more accepted. That is why you find so much differences in the cultures. तो इन्होंने एक अलग फंडा अपनाया कल्चर को एक्सप्लेन करने का. They deployed a different method of understanding the culture. And they said that everything was invented at one place. There were extreme diffusionists. There were thinkers who have been branded as extreme diffusionists. Initially, when they thought that Egypt was the center from where everything was invented, and that had then been dispersed into different directions. And they were termed as Egyptologists. They were termed as what? Egyptologists. So initial ideas of diffusionism were that everything was invented at one place. People went on to extend that only one place, that is Egypt, was the one from where every culture has diffused into different directions. Right? In this, some of the traits are lost. That is called as degenerationism. For example, there was W.H.R. Rivers, who explained that in the Australian tribes that he was observing, the native tribes of Australia, he was observing them and he was studying them. When he studied them, he found that they had very, very complex burial practices. Burial practices means the ritual of burying the dead. They had pretty complex burial practices. Right? And it was difficult for him to comprehend that all of them had invented them differently. In one place, Australia, in different places, you had different tribes that were living. Everyone had a different burial practice, and it was extremely unique and different from the other one. It was a pretty complex one. All of them were pretty complex in nature. He said that it is really difficult. I cannot think that these tribes have the capability of developing such complex traits. Plus, they are living on Australia, so they are isolated. But you do not find how these people reached Australia, because it is different from the mainstream area. They are living on an isolated island. They did not appreciate it. That how did they reach Australia? He thought that at one point of time, they had the capability of canoe building. Boat banana aata tha inko. But now they have lost this. This capability has degenerated. This capability has what? Degenerated. While this complex burial practice that they had brought it from different places is still with them. This was his argument, W.H.R. Rivers. Right? While the Egyptologists, they said that everything that you see around the world has started from the Egypt only, which was very difficult to comprehend also. Then you find what? Some things are invented in certain places. Of course, they are diffused in other places from there. For example, wheel, if it was invented at one place, it is difficult to imagine that the wheel was invented in almost all the places of the world. It might have been borrowed. That is why we even use the term today, reinventing the wheel. What is reinventing the wheel? What is meant by the reinventing of the wheel? For example, you are preparing for the civil services examination. Okay? Every time you go on inventing a new technique of studying, faces so many challenges. The whole point is already existing techniques can be curated into your own requirement for your own benefit to become successful in this examination. Reinvent the wheel. What is already known, you curate it and use it to your own benefit, or usko wapas reinvent kar do. That is reinventing of the wheel. This is embedded in the diffusionist idea. And then there were schools. German school of diffusionism, American school of diffusionism, British school of diffusionism. Right? In America, there was prominent anthropologist Franz Boas. Who is the father of the American anthropology, who is considered as the father of the American anthropology. To some extent, E.B. Tyler is considered as the father of the anthropologies or sociocultural anthropology. Right? Franz Boas was the American anthropologist. And he was studying the Native Americans. Native American, the original inhabitants of the America, because the America that we see today, they had migrated from the Europe only. They were the colonizers in the Americas. Right? Both North and South America. So there are so many native Indians that are there. He tried to observe them. Right? And he was extremely critical of the evolutionists. He was extremely critical of what? The evolutionists. And he said that such theorizing by taking secondary data is pretty wrong, because that is not at all scientific. To gather scientific data, you yourself have to go into the field and collect that data. You go into the field and collect that data. And how to know about the culture of the individuals? Let's say we want to understand our culture. We'll go into some history of our culture. But our histories are what? Written histories. Do we not find the histories of our cultures being found written in the texts? We have so many historical records that have talked about our past and the present that we are today. For example, to know today what we are, we know that independence happened in 1947. The Britishers ruled us 200 years before. Before that, there were Mughals. From thereupon, whatever problems we see today are a consequence of these rules that have been there. So our histories are written histories. Our histories are written histories. While in most of the tribal cultures, you find what? They do not have any written history. In many of the tribal cultures, we find that they do not have what? Written histories. Franz Boas said that to understand the histories of the tribals, you record their folklores. You record their folklores, which will give you immense understanding, because these are oral traditions. These are unwritten histories. You will only understand their culture if you understand these folklores, right? And he was the first one to emphasize that to understand any culture, you cannot just sit back home and comment on that culture. What you got to do is observe these cultures, right? And understand their practices in their own historical context. How to get the history? Through the oral tradition, through the stories, through the folklore that they have been telling to themselves. Right? To understand what? To appreciate any cultural practice, what you need to do is, you need to see it in their own context, in their own historical context. And this school of thought came to be known as historical particularism. What is it known as? Repeat it. Historical particularism. That is, to understand these cultures, the native Indian cultures, you need to go back into their histories. And because their histories are not written in nature, these are oral in nature, right? You need to record their folklores. And this understanding that was explained by Franz Boas, the American anthropologist, that to understand the culture of any tribe, you need to understand their history. You need to understand their cultural practices in the historical context, led to a new point of view of understanding things or cultures. And that is called as the idea of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism, which is what? Which is an idea that is opposed to the ethnocentrism that we have heard about. Ethnocentrism was what? Viewing the other cultures through your own cultural lens. Well, what is cultural relativism? Viewing the cultural practices of the other cultures in their own cultural context through their cultural lens. What it means to them. Who are you to judge their practices? Right? Let's say if they are doing shifting cultivation. Many of the tribes do shifting cultivation like Jum. If you see it from your perspective, you see it as what? Environment, not so environment friendly practice, because it is going to lead to the clearance of the forests. Agree? You are going to view it through your own lens, that they are not leading a settled life. What's the point of this? They're always on the move. Hunter-gatherers, they are always on the move. Agree or not? This kind of an approach that you judge those cultures on the basis of your own culture is called as an ethnocentric point of view. While if you start seeing their practices in their own context, it is called as what? Cultural relativism. Called as what? Repeat. Cultural relativism. Agree? So from evolutionism to historical, to diffusionism, to historical particularism, to the ideas like cultural relativism, which were a corollary of the historical particularism. And as such, in anthropology, the tool or the most important pillar of anthropology is the cultural relativism as an idea. The most important tool of anthropology is the cultural relativism as an idea. That is, if you have to understand any culture, you understand in their own context. Right? For example, in India, there are certain tribes which were considered as criminal tribes. Which were considered as what? Criminal tribes. And the British had also formed a Criminal Tribes Act. Because what British thought is that people who lead a settled life are the more civilized ones. While the people who are continuously on the move, who are more nomadic, are having criminal tendencies. Right? It was an ethnocentric view. What has the government of India done? It has denotified these tribes. That is, it has removed the stigma of being a criminal tribe. Following? So evolutionism to diffusionism to historical particularism. In fact, France was also accepted to some extent the diffusionist ideas. Right? What was happening here is all of these schools that we see right now, they were all focusing on what? A phenomena which is embedded in the history, in the past. Savagery is what? The people who are stuck in the past stages. Historical particularism is what? You understand the historical phenomena through their folklores, through their oral traditions. Diffusionism is what? One thing was invented at one point and diffused into different directions. Agree? Then came a radical change in the way in which the cultures were understood. Then came a radical change in the way in which the cultures were understood. And this change came in the British School of Anthropology. Franz Boas was American. E.B. Tyler was British, while L.H. Morgan was again American. In the British School of Anthropology, they said that we are not concerned with history here. Because the point of recording the history itself is so difficult. When you have unwritten history, how can you record that history? It will itself be unscientific in nature. Agree? So they were inspired by the schools of thoughts related or which were coming up in the sociology. And pioneers in this new approach was that they started calling anthropology as the study of now and here rather than of the history. If you have to explain any society, you explain what is happening there. Just refrain from giving just these broad generalizations. Let's say you go and find that polygamy is there in the society. What is the role that this polygamy is playing in this society? Right? With this came the ideas which are called as the next school of thought, which is called as functionalism. Functionalism or the structure functionalism. There are differences in both of them, but broadly, they're pretty much similar. What is the idea that is conveyed by them is, first, we need not get into the histories. Anthropology is the study of now and here rather than of the history. Because you're studying other cultures in the first place. And these tribal cultures do not have any written history. How are you going to explain the cultures that you call as the tribal cultures or the primitive cultures? Right? They came up with this idea of structural functionalism, that what you are explaining should be explained, that what is functioning right now, how these societies are functioning. And they said that any practice, any ritual, any institution that you see here in these cultures is just playing the role of maintenance of the society as a whole. Right? And all this understanding was based on one very important work that was again done by Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer had given an organic analogy of the society. What had he given? The organic analogy of the society. What was this organic analogy? He said that if you look at the society, to explain any society, and if you have to explain tribal culture, that is also society. So to explain any society, what you need to do is, you need to understand that society has so many smaller parts. Every society has so many smaller parts. It is composed of individuals first. It is composed of so many institutions: marriage, family, kinship, economic, political, religious institutions, right? All of these are smaller parts of the society, right? And every part is playing its role in the maintenance of the whole system. For example, in a human body, which is what? An organism. In human body, you have what? So many organs. Heart is there, kidney is there, liver is there, or we have brain is there, right? So you have so many organs in the human body. If any one stops functioning, will the body function? What you call as a living body, when all of these are functioning in tandem, they are functioning in a well-oiled machinery. Anyone stops, the whole body stops working, right? So he said that similarly in a society, you find what different parts that are playing their role in the larger whole that is called as the society, right? And what are these larger parts? They were called as the structure. The pioneers of these schools were Malinowski here. And he is also one of the biggest figures in anthropology. Question har saal aa hi jata hai inke. And structure functionalism is known for Radcliffe Brown. Radcliffe Brown. Right? Malinowski also brought about another change. He said that what Francois was saying is, you go and record these history, you get a hand on these histories. Malinowski introduced a new idea in anthropology, that if you have to understand the cultures, first thing that you need to do is go and live with these people like a native. If you have to understand these cultures, you go and live with these cultures like a native. Like a native is living. Only then whatever you record will be considered as a very important data. And this approach was called as the participant observation approach. What was it called? Participant observation. Participant observation. And he did this participant observation or used this as method of data collection, where he spent considerable time, almost 2 to 3 years, with a tribe in the islands in the Pacific Ocean, called as the Trobriand Islands. Called as the Trobriand Islands. And there he tried to study the different aspects of the Trobriand Islanders and their society. Right? And this tradition that was introduced by Malinowski is called as the field work tradition. What is it called? The field work tradition. Fieldwork tradition based on what? Participant observation. So what we were discussing initially about the caste system. One was what? Book view. Other is what? Field view. Field view, why? Because field view is the essence of anthropology. Field view is one of the important traditions in anthropology. You cannot understand a phenomena without doing the field view. Agree? You have been introduced to the vocabulary of evolutionism, diffusionism, psychic unity of mankind, savagery, barbarism, civilization, inventiveness of the mankind, degenerationism, historical particularism, ethnocentrism, cultural relativism. Everybody following these terms? To the next school, that is what? Functionalism, structure functionalism, which means what? Every part of the society is playing a role in the maintenance of the whole society. Right? Based on the Spencer's organismic analogy or organic analogy. Right? In this, the pioneers were Malinowski as a functionalist, Radcliffe Brown as a structure functionalist. Right? Malinowski is known for what? We'll go on doing this, Sanidhya. It's too early to understand the differences, but let's just acquaint ourselves with these ideas. ताकि केरला के SCRT पढ़ो तो कुछ समझ में आए. क्योंकि कल Saturday और Sunday है. And I expect you to read them going back home. Fine. So Malinowski was the pioneer here, and Malinowski has contributed a lot in the form of participant observation and what? Field work. So what you find as the important pillars in anthropology. First one is cultural relativism as one of the important pillars. Second is the field work tradition in anthropology. always seen as one of the important aspects of anthropology. There is, and a student a student of anthropology who does a course in university is expected to compulsorily do the field work. हम लोग तो नहीं कर सकते. We have limitations, but a student in university is expected to do field work. Without that, it is said that the person is not an anthropologist. That is the level or contribution of Malinowski to the anthropology. And this year, you might find there was a question in 2023 in the mains examination about what are the controversies related to Malinowski's fieldwork. Just go and find this question. Okay? Just browse your hands on all these things that you see in the syllabus, in the Kerala State SCRT, and in the 2023 question paper. Got it? From here upon, what happened is from Malinowski to functionalism and structure functionalism. This came as a study of what? Now and here, not the study of the histories of the tribal societies. They wanted to studies as they are functioning, like a well-oiled machinery. They wanted to study these societies in this fashion. Right? Then came another school of thought. कि कैसे explain करें society को? The idea of history had already become a past in the anthropological school of thought. Another school of thought came, and which came to be called as the structuralism. Anybody has the syllabus will see these terms mentioned in your syllabus. The next school of thought was what? Evolutionism, diffusionism, historical particularism, to functionalism, to structure functionalism, to structuralism now. What was the main idea behind structuralism? The pioneer in this, the main prominent thinker was Levi Strauss. Just listen as of now. घर जाके देख लेना, इसमें होगा. नहीं होगा तो aspirant होगा, क्योंकि असली में तो है. ठीक है? So the idea was structure functionalism. It was given by Levi Strauss. Jeans वाले नहीं, दूसरे वाले हैं ये. French philosopher हैं, Levi Strauss. Right? What was his idea was, he was the most controversial anthropologist. Controversial in the sense, what he was trying to convey was very difficult to understand for all of the fellow anthropologists. जो इसने बात बोली किसी का समझ नहीं आई क्या बोला इसने. Initially his theory was discarded. कि बोलना क्या चाहता है? What exactly does he want to convey? Right? He came up with the idea that to be able to explain the cultures, what you're observing in reality is of no use. Malinowski went to the field altogether, stayed with the tribes for 3 years, and then explained the phenomena. He discarded that altogether. कि कोई ज़्यादा point नहीं है उसका. How to explain the phenomena? It is based on the underlying mental structures. How can we explain the phenomena? It is through the underlying mental structures, and these mental structures are universal. ये बात अभी अपन ने थोड़ी देर पहले कहां सुनी? Evolutionism में भी सुना. They also talked about psychic unity of mankind. So it is a similar kind of thought process, but although in a different context. He does not want to go into the evolution as an idea. Right? He wants to go into the mental structure as an idea. That what is the underlying mental structure that is going on in the society that can explain the social phenomena that you see in the reality. If Radcliffe Brown had to talk about the structure of the society, he would talk about the different parts of the society. That marriage is an institution in the society, in this particular tribe. This is in this manner. It is linked to religion in this manner. It is linked to kinship in this manner. That is the structure of the society, which is actually being manifested on ground, that you can observe and see. Right? He did not want to take interest in that real social structure. What he is talking about is the mental structure. Levi Strauss. And he says that there is universality in these mental structure because human beings think in binary opposites. What do the human beings do? They think in binary opposites. It is not that he developed it on his own. He developed this idea on the basis of linguists, जो कि languages को observe कर रहे थे. And they found that languages are also based on binary opposites. In the language and its formation and its structure, you find binary opposites. Right? He borrowed that idea from there and then started using it in explaining the society. as the underlying mental structures across the humanity. He says that, and what is this underlying mental structure? It is the binary opposite. Right? He says that human beings, the underlying idea is of binary opposites. For example, caste system, let's say. Caste system is an idea, right? One of the thinkers who explained the caste system was Louis Dumont. Was whom? Louis Dumont. He explained the caste system and said that this hierarchy and everything that you see is because of two binary opposites that can explain everything in the caste system. And these are purity and impurity. These are what? Purity and impurity. Right? Similarly, he talked about so many binary opposites. Raw and cooked. Raw has some meaning. Cooked has certain meaning. Nature versus culture. In the lap of the nature, you are living like anything. But when you have culture, you become human beings. He talked about so many binary opposites. And these were used by later thinkers like Louis Dumont to explain the caste system through the binary opposites. That is pure and impure. Right? What he was talking about is the underlying mental structures. Underlying mental structures. And this school came to be known as what? Structuralism. It was criticized for abstract ideas, right? Not to be found in reality. He says that you cannot even observe these binary opposites. So फिर मतलब क्या है इसका पढ़ने का? That came as a criticism to this. His complex idea itself was criticized. Initially he was criticized for with the words like that he's trying to trick people. He's using some confidence trick to fool people in anthropology. But then slowly and steadily, people started using this paradigm to explain idea. For example, Louis Dumont tried to explain. To some extent, what he has explained is true in the caste system also. For example, occupation, you find there are certain occupations which are pure and impure. Food, there are certain foods that are pure and impure. Agree? People, there are pure and impure. Caste, there are pure and impure. That is what was the underlying idea under the caste system. So this is how the Louis Dumont also explained. So this came to be known as the school, which is called as what? Structuralism. Then came another school after this. They went away from all these ideas. They wanted to explain how the culture is there. Right? How the culture is there and how the culture lives in the environment in which this culture is developing. It was an ecological approach. It came to be known as what? The cultural ecology. This school of thought came to be known as what? Cultural ecology. They followed a very different point of line to explain the cultures. This school of thought came to be known as what? Cultural ecology. Which means what? The pioneers or the thinkers in this are Julian Stewart, Marvin Harris. Marvin Harris is also known for cultural materialism. That is a discussion for another day. Right? They said that if you have to understand the cultural practices or the tribal practices, as you call it already, because anthropology is the study of these other cultures, you need to understand how they are functioning in tandem with their environment. How these cultural practices are functioning in the ecological context. Only then you will be able to explain the tribal cultures. Right? There was a thinker called as Roy A. Rappaport. Right? Not mentioned in your syllabus, but he is one of the important cultural ecologists. He observed a tribe in Pacific Ocean. And he found that they had a ritual ceremony in which they massacred so many pigs. Pig feast hota tha unke andar. Only on ritual occasions. They had what? Pig feasts. Right? And his work is known as Pigs for Ancestors. And this feast was celebrated as a respect for their ancestors. And they had to explain this phenomenon. They said that for them it might look like a very sacred phenomena. But how do we explain this? Why are they doing it? If you look at the root cause, he says that the explanation can be seen in the ecological context. He said that where the tribes are living, the pigs, the population increases rapidly. Population of the pigs increases rapidly and pigs eat a lot. ये तो बात पता ही अपने को. Pigs eat a lot. Stop eating like a pig. That is a common jargon or slang that is used. Right? They eat a lot. So it was explained that the pigs and the humans are relying on the same nature or the surroundings. So if they are not ritually sacrificed every year and at every occasion, then their population is going to go out of control. Hence, they have ritualized in the form of this occasion where they are dedicating this ritual of sacrificing the pigs and having a pig feast to dedicate it to their ancestors. So how they've explained the ritual phenomena? Through the ecological explanation. Where one system, one phenomena will lead to an impact on the other phenomena. If this ritual is stopped, according to them, ultimately the humans might move away from that area or might die because the pigs are going to be everywhere and they will have no food to eat. Humans will have no food to eat. It came as a school which is called as what? The cultural ecology. And Pigs for Ancestors was the name of the work by Roy A. Rappaport. Got it? Then there are so many other schools, but one of the prominent schools that we should discuss today, so that you are acquainted with this, is the symbolic and the interpretive school. And it is very interesting also. Which school? Symbolic and interpretive school. Symbolic and interpretive school. अब हुआ क्या कि सबने इतना ज्ञान दे दिया कल्चर्स के ऊपर, सबने अपनी अपनी थियरी बना दी. Everybody came out with this idea. Clifford Geertz was one of the thinkers, and Victor Turner was another thinker in the symbolic anthropology. Clifford Geertz and what? Victor Turner. Clifford Geertz said that it is really difficult to comprehend a culture. What you are saying about that culture is only your explanation. What you are saying about that culture is your explanation. If tomorrow he goes and explains the culture, it will be his explanation. So understanding of the cultures is open to interpretation. Understanding of the cultures is open to interpretations. Right? And he says that whatever these cultures are practicing, the rituals that they are practicing, in these they are telling a story themselves. The task of an anthropologist is to go, observe, record that, and then accept that it is my work. Not necessarily I'm doing any generalization. Any other person can come and interpret it in a different manner. So he made it more subjective. He made it more open-ended, that anybody can go, and this approach came to be called as the interpretive approach. Open to ideas. You go, understand, explain it through any school, but that is only yours. That is not, you cannot force it that this is the only explanation. This is only one explanation that is there, right? And another emphasis of this school was to focus upon symbols of a culture. Why? Because culture is symbolic. The human beings and their ability to develop such a complex way of life is because of their ability to symbolize the world. And Clifford Geertz talked about symbols being the more representative phenomena in a society. In fact, everything that is happening in a culture is symbolic in nature, according to Clifford Geertz. And one of the common example, and then he developed his methodology, thick and thin description. Thick and thin description. He said that if you look at the phenomena of blinking the eyes, आंखें बंद अपन मिचका रहे हैं, it has no meaning. But if I wink, does it have a meaning? If I wink, does it have a meaning? How would you interpret it? If I wink it to a boy, if I wink it to a girl, does it have a different meaning? It is a symbol, right? So every activity you see in the society is symbolic in nature. Task of the anthropologist is to interpret and explain those symbols in the society, right? The explanation that you associate with the idea of wink also looks like a biological phenomenon. कि आँख ही तो बंद की है, क्या किया मैंने? But it has a social connotation also. That kind of description that you give about these phenomena is called as thick description. Well, only the biological aspect of it, that if you open one eye and just close one eye and the biological reflex that is happening, that is thin description. Okay? So he talked about symbolic. Similarly, he talked about a cockfight that used to happen in Bali in Indonesia, Balinese cockfight. And then he gave his explanation of what exactly does this cockfight convey. What is the status of the winner? Whose cock is more powerful there? Which rooster is more powerful? They used to use such terms, right? And then they try to explain the social dynamics of the society. What winning in this fight means for increasing the stature of the individual who has won that fight in the society. So he went on to describe that. And he says that what the explanation is only mine. Don't mistake it as a generalization. It is only mine. It is interpretive. It is symbolic. Similarly, Victor Turner, he related this to Mudi tree. There is a tree in the Ndembu tribes in Africa. There's a tribe called as Ndembu. And they have a tree which is called as the Mudi tree. Right? They associated it with various phenomena in the society, like the puberty of the girls in the society. So they came out with such explanations in the form of symbolic and interpretive. What started as a theory of evolution, then transformed into diffusionism, then was replaced by historical particularism, and then was replaced by your functionalism, structure functionalism, and then we find Levi-Strauss's structuralism, cultural ecology, and your symbolic and interpretive anthropology. Right? There are a few other schools also, like neo-evolutionism. Right? So some change might have been done to the original evolutionist theory, and people might have come out with neo-evolutionism. Right? So that is another school of thought here, neo-evolutionism. And last but not the least, the present thought, and there is also cognitive anthropology. There is one cognitive anthropology, which is basically a development over the structuralism. They said that you are talking about underlying unobservable structures. Cognitive anthropology said that we are talking about underlying observable structures. That is cognitive anthropology. And lastly, after this, the last and the latest approach is called as the postmodernist approach. Which approach? Postmodernism or postmodernist approach. Okay? What is this postmodernist? Last, we'll conclude with this. What is this postmodernist approach? It is said that whatever theories that had developed as a result of the age of enlightenment and the so-called sciences that you have developed, right? So-called sciences that you have developed, they say that science is said to be saying the truth. Science is known to be saying what? The truth. Science such bol rahi hai. Kyun? Because it is based on empirical evidence. It is based on proof. It is based on proof. When this idea is extrapolated into social sciences, again, it gave the idea that whatever social science is saying is also truth. Right? So the modern world that had started after Renaissance, after Industrial Revolution, is known for what? In history, we divide the history into ancient, medieval, and modern. So modern world is known for the ideas like rationality, empiricism, right, and science. And that led to the explanation of certain phenomena, social phenomena, and they were proclaimed as being truths. Ye sach hai. Yahi sach hai, in fact. Later, this approach of restricting the truth only to one paradigm was criticized in the later approach that's called as postmodernist approach. How can Malinowski say that what I am saying is the only truth? Chinta ho gayi. Itni kahani. Right? So they started questioning the idea of truth and the authority, because they said that whatever you have studied is again in your context. Whatever way you try, you cannot do away with your biases. So when you explain a culture, if let's say you have to explain a culture, you have to explain what? You also should explain your own biases and backgrounds. Your own biases and backgrounds. For example, there is a very famous field work, just a last example of that happened in Philippines. There is Rosato Ronaldo, who was doing his field work in Philippines. And they had a very typical practice that whenever somebody died in their society, they were outraged and they would go on hunting the heads of the other tribes. Kya karenge wo? When somebody would die in their society, in rage, they would go and hunt the other tribes and cut their heads and bring it as a trophy. Head hunting. Anthropology mein ye sab sunna padega. Female feticide, head hunting. In Nagas, there is also practice of head hunting in Konyak Nagas. Now it might not be that prevalent, but it had existed at one point of time. Right? So he observed that in the Philippines, in this tribe, out of rage, they used to hunt the heads of the other tribes. But he could not relate to this phenomenon. It looks weird, sounds pretty odd. And I cannot go to the extent of explaining it through the ideas of cultural relativism. Looks fine, but I find this problematic to some extent. I cannot justify this at any cost. Right? But during this fieldwork, his wife died. Rosetta Ronaldo's wife died. And then he was also outraged. He also had a rage in his mind. And then he said that now I can better associate with the rage that these tribes go through. In this grief that I have faced, now I can relate to them. Right? What I was trying to explain before this event happened to me. ऐसा नहीं कि जाके अपनी वाइफ को मार देना है फील्ड वर्क में, ऐसा नहीं है, या ऐसा कुछ अपने साथ कि अपने घर में कोई डेथ होगी तभी अपन समझ पाएंगे. But he says that at least accept this, that what you're saying is your truth, not everybody's truth. And a glimpse of that we have already seen in what? The interpretive approach. Interpretive approach again says what? That what you're observing is only your interpretation. It is out and open for interpretation. Right? And when you interpret, postmodernism says, also tell your biases and backgrounds. That's the essence of postmodernism. Prominent thinkers in this, Michel Foucault, Arjun Appadurai, etc. Right? So this is a glimpse of how the anthropology began as what? From Renaissance, which led to the belief in the man, to the age of exploration, to the age of enlightenment, to the idea of degenerationism, which was a biblical idea, to the idea of progressivism. This progressivism was reflected in the biological anthropology through Darwinism. And what we find in the physical anthropology is everything related to the idea of Darwin's theory of the evolution only. And what we find in the sociocultural anthropology is the study of the other cultures has been done in many manners, which were earlier inspired by these progressivist ideas in the European society. Pioneers were Herbert Spencer's, etc. Later followed by the initial anthropologists like E.B. Tyler and L.H. Morgan. Right? Later, Franz Boas deployed a new way of understanding the cultures. Then Malinowski in functionalism, Radcliffe Brown in structure functionalism, Levi Strauss in structuralism, Marvin Harris, Julian Stewart in cultural ecology. Right? And Clifford Geertz and Victor Turner in symbolic and interpretive approach. That is the basic crux of anthropology for you and anthropological theories. Because without theories, whenever you try to interpret anything, there is no point of that. They need to be done in detail. We are going to do them in detail. This was just a brief overview of the discipline, what exactly you are going to deal with in the coming classes. Go back home, read the SCRT book. It starts with a chapter on what is culture, what is the definition, what is the understanding of the anthropology. Just go through that. Try to read it like a novel. Like the things that we have studied, you might find certain terms that you have heard in this class known to you if you have not started studying the SCRT book. Okay, any questions? Any questions regarding how the course is going to go on? Abhi academic question nahi lenge kyunki there is no point. Yes, Sanidhya. Unmute yourself and talk.
Sir, would we be provided the hard copies of the study material?
Hard copy, actually, if I'm giving you individual handouts, that you'll have to take a print out of that. If you live in Delhi, you can come and pick it up from here. Right? I'm not going to give you any pre-printed material before the classes. There's no point of that. For that, I want you to go to the books. That is a better way of studying. That's my personal belief. मैं तुमको मटेरियल पकड़ा दूंगा तो मटेरियल लेके सो जाओगे जाके, कोई मतलब नहीं उसका. There's no point. Right? So whatever PDF you get on the e-learn, you can take a print out of that. ठीक है? अरे स्लो, ज्यादा खाओगे इंडाइजेशन हो जाएगा. उतना ही पढ़ो जितना ग्रास्प कर सकते हो इनिशियल में, क्योंकि ये ऑलरेडी सब्जेक्ट नया है आप लोगों के लिए. कुछ सालों में ये बातें मन में बस जाएंगी. लिवाई स्ट्रॉस, स्ट्रक्चरलिज्म, हाँ ठीक है, अब क्या करें, अब आंसर राइटिंग वैल्यूडेशन बताओ सर, वो भी करेंगे. बट दिस इज द फर्स्ट फेज. व्हेन यू आर स्टार्टिंग इट, स्टार्ट इट इन द राइट पर्सपेक्टिव, क्योंकि अगर स्टार्ट गलत हो गई, then that creates a problem for very longer period of time in the UPSC preparation. लोगों को 3 अटेम्प्ट के बाद रियलाइज होता है गलत ऑप्शन ले लिया. क्यों? क्योंकि शुरू में पढ़ा ही सही से नहीं था। कोई भी ऑप्शन चूज कर लिया, इफ यू स्टडीड प्रॉपरली, yes, you can join the class next week if you have opted for the offline. No worries in that. ठीक है? So see you on Monday then with a new lecture. Just go back, revise, just start from the Kerala State SCRT. Any questions? I'll share my phone number. All of you have my number? No? I'll share it. We'll create a WhatsApp group. कोई जिम्मेदार आदमी इसकी जिम्मेदारी लो व्हाट्सएप ग्रुप बनाने की। उसके बाद जिम्मेदारी मैं ले लूंगा, पर एक बार चालू तुम कर दो। ठीक है? The group will be created and you just ping me, I'll share you the link, then you join it. Fair enough. My email ID is there on the website. जाके वहां से इतना डाउट एकदम से रातों रात नहीं आ जाएगा, I'm sure. कि रात को सैटरडे को 12 बजे याद करना पड़ेगा, सर वो डाउट आ गया एकदम से, वो बाद में आएगा, अभी इट इज टू अर्ली फॉर दैट। ठीक है? सी यू देन ऑन मंडे।